doing a little bit of ACE research on the history of the founders of North Bend, which is Frederick J. Simpson. He was the son of Asa Simpson or Asa Simpson. Not sure exactly how it's pronounced, but I found quite a bit about the family through my research and study, so I'm going to get into that and read you some cool history. But first, I just wanted to give you a little overview of where we're at and why I started studying this as I found this as an area of interest. So this is the area that I'll be taking a look at. This is Cape Arago right here, and then you have this is Shore Acres and Sunset. Go do your chores, Gideon. And the first thing that struck me about this area in Sunset Bay here was these what looks like poured cement tracks, and if you zoom out you can see that they're in this very circular pattern. Oh, here's Sunset right here, but there's some poured cement tracks that go through right here, and then once you zoom out, you see that the tracks go all the way through, and it's form this kind of circular pattern here, which is just kind of interesting for, supposedly natural area. And we'll just take a look at some of the pictures. That's Squaw Island. This is on Sunset Bay. More pictures from Sunset. That's the lighthouse. That's like right here, I believe. I think this is the lighthouse. Squaw Island. Bunch of dead trees on the island. Very cute. The lighthouse. And one of the things that we noticed out at Shore Acres was that, let's see if we can, oops. Yeah, we can zoom in a little bit. So it has these really interesting lines here through the Terra, and it goes all the way along the coast, and even I'll show you these concretions, and everything kind of goes in this angle, and it just is very curious. All right, so that's where we're looking at. And then I'm going to show you some of my own pictures here that I took. Now this is a little bit further down at, this is a little bit further down the coast towards Bandon, but they have these concretions all over here, which concretions are these ball-like structures that are within solid rock, and they're all along here. I'll show you some more close-ups, and they can be either round or kind of a flattened oblong shape like this, but here is a ton of them. There's just a ton of them all over here, and you can see that it's really interesting how everything erodes around it, because it almost looks like lava, like it's so crazy looking. And the whole area on this whole beach, this is down at Seven Devils Seven Devils Beach, and you just walk along it to, I think, 5 Mile Point is what it's called, but they're just everywhere, all through this rock here. And even look at this is, I think, what's called 5 Mile Point. And I mean, this just looks melted to me. This looks like something melted it. And the ocean doesn't come up this high. This is like a very high sort of bluff. And by the way, on top of this 5-mile point is a golf course. So, you know, they've covered the whole thing up, and who knows what's underneath of there now, but see how they're all going? Okay, I think this one is at Shore Acres near the tennis courts. And see how they all kind of go pointing in the same direction? And yeah, I get like the water would at the bottom and swish away all of the bottom of them, but then what's the excuse for it being at the same angle as all of the layers of strata or terra, like right next to it? See, we're looking across, and then there's a big like inlet right here, and I'll show you a picture of that in a second. But all of the layers, the geological layers, all go in this angled direction. Yeah, this is over at Shore Acres has just a ton of these concretions. Okay, so this is where we were just looking. So all of these layers here, and when the water's a little bit lower, there's one layer right here that hasn't quite eroded as much as the other, and there's this whole line that's higher of rock. And interestingly, we didn't see this water coming out when we went there on Wednesday. So I'm really not sure. I was actually hoping to find the source of this groundwater. It wasn't even flowing. But this is Shore Acres by the tennis court. It's a very, very cool little area because it has these little shallow pools of water. Okay, so that's as far as all the pictures I have that I'm going to show you. But now I'm going to read to you some of the history of these folks. So, first of all, the guy that started or founded North Bend was Frederick Simpson. This is his dad, Captain Asa Meade Simpson. He was born in 1825 in Maine, and he was a captain and master shipbuilder. And he came over to, I'll read you the whole article. I have a whole article about Asa Simpson. But I just wanted to show you all the way back, because my kids are going to watch this too, because this is the history of our town. So his parents were Thomas Simpson and Mary Wire Simpson, and they were born all the way back in 1784. And, you know, my theory was that all of the founders of this country were Freemasons, and this has proved that that theory is not correct. These people were not Freemasons. These were pioneers for sure. They actually came from, you'll see in just a moment, they came from Scotland. But here is, this is Grandpa of Frederick Simpson. And then we'll look at Lewis Simpson. They were in Maine. 1747. Okay, and again, these folks were in Maine. And then you have his dad, William Simpson, which was born in 1691. And, okay, so now we're finally back to Ireland. So this is as far back as I could find on any history of this family. It has his wife, and this is pretty cool. So let's take a look at what they are telling us. Now, this is in Ireland. This is a gravestone in Ireland. And it says, this boulder taken from their old homestead is erected in memory of William Simpson and Agnes Lewis Simpson, who came from Scotland and settled at Simpson's Point in Brunswick, Maine, about 1735. So they were settled before the United States was even established. These graves were really cool. I was so bummed to see them in such disarray, but this is Agnes, and this is the late Alfred. Was it Alfred? Oh no, William. William died March 4th, 1771. So, yeah, they had their own little gravestones, and that was put in front of one of the boulders that was taken. Oh, okay, so the burial is in Maine. So, wow. I wonder if I might be able to find any further information, because this was the best information I could find, was at this Find a Grave. But yeah, pretty awesome history. So now I'm going to read to you about Asimede Simpson, lumberman and shipbuilder. Wiry, alert, and active until a few days before his death at the age of 90, Captain Asimede Simpson was, for nearly 6 decades, an almost legendary figure in the lumbering and shipping interests of the Pacific coast. From a career as would-be gold miner to ownership of 60-some sailing vessels and tugs and more than 40,000 acres of virgin timberland in Oregon and Washington, Simpson, using sagacity and economic daring, built his empire on the Pacific. His exploitation of Oregon's resources, her long-grained corridor for shipbuilding, natural harbors at the Columbia River, the Umpqua and Coos Bay, and matchless 19th century forests of uncut fir marked him as a pioneer figure in the development of the state. Asimede Simpson was born February 20th, 1826 at Brunswick, Maine, the sixth child of Thomas and Mary Wire Simpson. His youth was spent on his father's farm with 5 younger half-brothers and sisters. At the age of 17, his life changed markedly when he was apprenticed to a shipbuilder in the nearby seaport city. Within 4 years, the young man had mastered much of the trade and had invested in small savings sufficient to provide a 30-second interest in the trading vessel Birmingham. The Simpson was not a landsman speculator. He boarded the Birmingham as supercargo, sailed around Cape Horn, and arrived in San Francisco in April 1850. 2 weeks of mining with his shipmates convinced the young man that fortunes were not to be made as readily in the Sierras as perhaps near the Golden Gate. He returned to San Francisco with, that's a picture of him, 50 ounces of gold. His sole estate for the Birmingham was wrecked and lost at Valparaiso, Chile, on her return voyage to the east. If the loss of his ship interest and the dim prospect of a life in a strange land were not enough, Simpson soon lost half of his gold in a loan to a firm which went bankrupt, and the other half to a thief. Thus the 24-year-old man was left entirely to his own initiative. He soon turned to lumber, and lumber was the key to the financial success which made him a millionaire several times over during the next 65 years. Simpson began to work as a carpenter in Stockton, California, building a house and peddling the unsold lumber which had been part of the cargo of the Birmingham. He was joined by an old friend from Maine, S.R. Jackson, and in the fall of 1850, they established the firm of Simpson and Jackson. No sooner had his retail lumber yard in business than Simpson began a search for timber and mill sites. for in the early 1850s, nearly as much lumber came round the Horn as was cut in California. In the fall of 1851, Simpson turned north and visited the small harbor at Trinidad, California, sailed along the Oregon coast, and entered the Columbia River. His journey was an adventurous one, for little of the west coast of America had been explored and charted. The overland journeys of Jedediah Smith, Ewing Young, and Michael Laframboise were unknown to the men of the gold rush decade, and it was only in the spring of 1850 that the Winchester expedition, sailing on the Samuel Roberts out of San Francisco, entered the Rogue and Umpqua rivers of southern Oregon. At the time of Simpson's swing north, the settlement at Port Orford was simply a miner's camp in fear of Indian attack. Umpqua City was only a cabin and tin-roofed building in the dunes at the mouth of the Umpqua River. Despite the newness of settlement and the risk of chartering vessels to spread their sails to the winds along the Pacific shores, Simpson saw promise at the Pacific Northwest. At Astoria, he salvaged the Potomac, a recently wrecked vessel in which he owned a small interest. He had her towed to Portland by the Lot Whitcomb, and there his brother, Lewis P. Simpson, refitted and loaded the ship with lumber and pilings for the California market. Captain Simpson, in the meantime, purchased a half-finished sawmill in Astoria. Though the operation lasted but 2 years, 10,000 to 15,000 board feet of lumber were turned out daily for use as plank sidewalks in San Francisco. Encouraged by these prospects, Simpson expanded his retail business in 1852 by opening a lumber yard in Sacramento in partnership with J. G. Jackson. In later years, A. W. Simpson, another brother of the captain, managed this firm. Look at that old timber. Beautiful. In April of 1852, Captain Simpson sailed on the schooner Harriet to the Umpqua River to investigate timberlands and milling sites at that shipping point to the mines of southern Oregon. While he was at the Umpqua, he visited the small settlement of Scottsburg, where the long lines of mules began their journeys along the muddy trails towards Eugene City or the Rogue River Valley, loaded with packs of flour, tinned goods, clothing, shovels, and mining pans. After Simpson set his crew to work cutting piling at the Umpqua, he attempted to hike south along the coast to the unexplored harbor of Coos Bay. He and his 2 companions were scared back to the Umpqua when they met dozens of Indians at 10 Mile Creek in the sand dunes north of Coos Bay Harbor. While Simpson and party retraced their steps, other, perhaps bolder adventurers spied out Coos Bay, organized the COOS Bay Commercial Company, and by the fall of 1853 pushed through the mountains from their homes on the Oregon-California Trail to settle in the coast region. Some of these men, like Freeman G. Lockhart and Curtis Noble, found surface coal veins near their farms. By October of 1853, 19 claims had been made on the mineral sites. Coal, if it were to be mined, needed a market, and in the 1850s there was no market but San Francisco. Coal to San Francisco meant shipping was needed. Captain Asa Simpson was ready for the opportunity. His interest in Coos Bay had not dimmed, and in 1855 he sailed to Port Orford and then hiked overland for 40 miles through the forests and along the gold-rich beaches to the region where coal had been discovered. His observations convinced him that his ventures at Coos Bay could be made doubly profitable. A mill there could cut lumber for deck loads for his vessels, coal from the mines of Northrop and Simmons or Flanagan and Rogers would fill the holds. On May 1st, 1856, Lewis P. Simpson, another brother from, look at these old pictures. I'm going to zoom in. This is a logging camp. Oh, so nice to see some real men. Look at this guy. Oh, yeah. These are hardworking guys. Look at this guy. Looks so young. He looks like a baby. Oh, my gosh. But yet, you can just see in their faces, these were tough old men. Look at how big their forearms were. That's how my husband was. He had big old forearms. And here is, wow, look at them just standing on those big logs. Look how big those logs are. This is one of the ways they used to do and transport a lot of these logs. They'd put them in the river, and then they would just stay in the river, and that would keep them from drying out. It'd keep the bugs off of them, and it was just easy to load and unload right out of the water. And they still do that. Maybe if I go back to Google Earth after I'm done reading this article, I'll show you they still have an area where they do this out in Coquille. These old logging photos are really, really neat. So anyways, his other brother from Maine arrived in Coos Bay on the brig of the Quadratus with mill machinery and supplies for the new enterprise. When the vessel attempted to beat her way across the wide and shallow bar, she grounded and lay dangerously in the surf as swells worked around her. Young Simpson attempted to save a woman passenger and her child, but the three drowned when a lifeboat capsized in the breakers. The others aboard the Quadratus were saved, and much of the mill equipment was salvaged. The Simpsons mill began operation late in 1856 at a site on the bay called North Bend, and operated almost continuously until the 1920s. At least three other mills, though of much less commercial significance, were cutting lumber in southwestern Oregon before the Simpson firm. In 1853, Stacy, Fundy, and Wasson operated a muley sash saw run by an undershot water wheel on the Fahey Ranch on the lower Coquille River. As early as 1854, the sawmill of Neefus and H.B. Tichenor was cutting up to 5,000 feet per day at Garrison Lake near Port Orford. These two ventures, far more successful than laborious whipsawing, provided lumber for the rifle boxes, sluices, and shanties of Randolph, Port Orford, Elizabethtown, and Prattsville, mining towns along the coast of Coos and Curry counties. In 1856, H. Luce began cutting lumber at his mill at Empire on Coos Bay, and only shipped out the first cargo because of the delays the Simpson firm suffered from the wreck of the Quadratus. Asa Simpson purchased the mill at Port Orford in 1860, but a forest fire swept through the region and destroyed all the buildings, machinery, and timberlands in his holdings before he could ever commence operations. Wow, this guy sure had lots of, it's pretty crazy. This is in the 1800s. We're talking horse and buggy. And, man, and just virgin land, just crazy. Late in 1856 or early in 1857, after the wreck of the Quadratus, the floundering of the Potomac, and the drowning of another of his brothers, Isaiah Simpson, on the Michigan near Cape Disappointment, Simpson initiated pilot service for his own vessels. Kids, you need to keep it down. He entered into a partnership with Captain George Flavel at Astoria, and during the next 2 decades, several Simpson tugs were used on the nearby Columbia River bar. Among these were Ranger, Hunter, the Brenham, the Columbia, and the Astoria. Also in 1857, Simpson opened his packet line. I said shush! Golly. This is for them. This is actually going to be our next homeschool study on history of North Bend, but these kids need to finish their chores. The partnership with George Flavel lasted until 1887, when Simpson purchased all interest in ships held by the famous bar pilot. Thus, within 7 years of his arrival on the Pacific coast, Simpson was already involved in far-flung enterprises and was earning handsomely from his lumber sales and freighting. The next step The next step in his empire building was to call upon his youthful experience as a shipbuilder. In 1857, the keel was laid at North Bend, Oregon, for the first Simpson-built ship on the Pacific coast. In 1858, the Blanco, a two-masted, 238-ton ship, slid down the ways, and the latest venture, a business that would build 58 vessels, 33 of which were to enter Simpson's own fleet, was launched. That same year, the tug Fearless, a former brig built in Calcutta and refitted by Simpson in San Francisco, arrived at COOS Bay. This little picture. COOS Bay Bar. This looks like the great ships of COOS Bay. They did these clipper ships. We were famous for them. Came out of COOS Bay. Pilot the trading ships and assist at the shipyards where the fine cedars of Southwest Oregon was adzed. Adzed? I've never heard that word. I'll have to look it up. Steamed and molded into new vessels. Adzed, maybe that is dipped in the tar or pitch, is my guess. But I'll have to look it up. In 1860, while the Simpson yards were building the 185-ton brig ARAGO, Asa M. Simpson extended his interest to Washington Territory. At Willapa Harbor, he named a site South Bend and erected a sawmill there in partnership with the Riddle brothers. Later, Simpson built the first sawmill and shipyards at Hoquiam at Grays Harbor and purchased the sawmill of Knapp and Grant at Knappton, Washington. Still another brother, Captain Robert W. Simpson, joined the family enterprises when he arrived at North Bend, Oregon in 1863. By 1867, he was working closely with the company's master shipbuilder, John W. Cruz. Among the vessels designed and constructed by them was the first 5-masted schooner built on the Pacific coast. The 193-foot Lewis, which came off the ways on August 11th, 1889. August 11th is my birthday. This ship, which would carry 1,650 tons of coal or 1 million board feet of lumber, cost the Simpson brothers about $30 million. Year after year, large sums of money from lumber sales and freighting were poured back into the shipbuilding enterprises. One of the prize vessels of the Simpson fleet was the Western Shore, built on COOS Bay in 1874 at the cost of about $70,000. This ship was a masterpiece of beauty and speed, with construction by John Cruz, sail design by Captain Robert W. Simpson, and keel and hull specifications by Captain Asa M. Simpson. She sailed from San Francisco in February 1875 and anchored in the Mersey River in England 103 days later, breaking all speed records. A trip from San Francisco at Astoria required but 48 hours for the Western Shore. Loaded with 1,800 tons of wheat, she sailed from the mouth of the Columbia to Cobh, Queenstown, Ireland in only 101 days in 1875. The speedy vessel lost on the Dexbury Reef. Oh, wow. Look at that. Wow. I mean, this is just crazy. These captains of these boats were awesome. So that one was lost near the Golden Gate in 1878. Brought her owners a profit of $23,000 on her first passage alone. Simpson refused to carry any insurance on his vessels, and during the years he lost 34 ships, an estimated loss of $500,000. Asa Simpson was once heard to remark on one of his many voyages to the eastern United States and Europe, "My life's work has been getting knocked down and getting on my feet again." The lumberman had more to recover from than shipwrecks, mill fires, drops in the lumber market, and the loss of 11 million board feet of lumber in his retail yard in San Francisco in the earthquake and fire of 1906 were blows which shook but never capsized the Simpson fortunes as long as the old captain was alive. By 1891, Simpson Enterprises included mills cutting 450,000 board feet daily at COOS Bay, Crescent City, Willapa Harbor, Grays Harbor, Gardiner, and the Columbia River. In conjunction with most of his sawmills, Simpson owned a company town, mercantile stores, rentals, ready return on wages paid to sawmill and shipyard employees. Typical of these businesses was that on the Umpqua at Gardiner, Oregon, an enterprise which operated from 1864 to 1923. Simpson also speculated in coal and owned controlling interests in the mines at Renton, Washington. Captain Asa Simpson married Sophie Smith at Racine, Wisconsin in 1875. They became the parents of 3 sons and 1 daughter. One of the captain's son's sisters, Mary, married California pioneer Miller Austin Sperry, the founder of Sperry Flour Company. And upon the death of her husband in 1881, Mary Sperry, readily employing her Simpson's business. Okay, can we just take a minute and note the names of the last 2 women that we just talked about? What was the one? Smith. Sophie Smith. Sophie Smith and Mary Sperry. I mean, they almost sound like fake names. I hate to laugh because actually, Mary Sperry, readily employing her Simpson business sense, assumed the senior partnership in the company, incorporated the business in 1884, and directed much of its expanding activities. Mary Simpson Sperry was one of San Francisco's picture break. Pretty cool, huh? All with sailboats. San Francisco's most ardent suffragettes and worked closely with Susan B. Anthony, Ann Shaw, and Carrie Chapman Catt in their struggles. Many have singled out Asa Mead Simpson as the legendary Cappy Ricks, fiery, reckless, and wealthy hero of the novels of Peter Kyne. Certainly many of the Simpsons' exploits, financial coups, and scrapes are reminiscent of the adventures of Kyne's fictional hero, yet Stanley Dollar of the steamship lines and Captain J.A. Hooper have equally claim as models for the character of Cappy Ricks. In 1899, the aging master of the Simpson fortunes began delegating responsibilities to his eldest son, 22-year-old Louis Jerome Simpson. And in that year, the young man who had dropped out of the University of California in 1897 to take a year's world cruise arrived to assume command of the family's enterprise at North Bend. Within 3 years, he had acquired new acreage, laid out a city, rebuilt the old sawmill, purchased the Porter Mill, started an ice plant, a sash and door company, a woolen mill, and was the new mayor and postmaster of the town. In the meantime, Asa M. Simpson continued his tight control of finances from his offices in San Francisco and Stockton, and until the week before his death on January 10, 1950, he personally signed checks and answered much of the company's mail. The passing of the old captain brought lengthy notices in Western papers, but his death signaled an end to the far-flung Simpson empire. Louis J. Simpson continued the family operations at North Bend, and in 1918, he was the Republican nominee for governor of Oregon. Popularly running as the handsome stranger, young Simpson spent his wealth lavishly on travel, entertainment, and homes. His seaside estate, today Shore Acres State Park, was the site of 2 rambling mansions complete with ballrooms, indoor swimming pools, and tennis courts. The first home was destroyed by fire in 1921. And interesting to note that his wife died in May of 1921. This is on a Wikipedia. His wife died in May of 1921. His house burned down in June of 1921. So just a few months later, his house and mansion burned down. And he remarried the next year in 1922. And it says that the couple adopted 2 infant girl babies. So this is the only questionable portion of all this story. I've been so intrigued by this whole story. And it all seemed very, very typically like settler like, except for this, the burning down of the house. It was like a couple months after his wife died and his house burned down. So then he built a second home, 224-foot long mansion. It was erected on the sandstone bluffs south of Coos Bay on the 1,500-acre Simpson Ranch during the years of 1927 and 1930. On the estate were 2,000 feet of boxwood and hawthorn hedges, a sunken oriental garden with imported stone lanterns, acres of roses, flowers, trees from all over the world, and 400 feet of vine-covered pergolas. 12 gardeners tended the grounds, while other Simpson employees operated the dairy ranch south of the estate. Lavish living, the Depression, land promotion schemes such as those at Lakeside and Empire near Coos Bay, a change in lumber market, all were ingredients in the decline of Simpson fortunes in Oregon. Timberlands were liquidated, and the partial estate of Short Acres passed to the state of Oregon before the death of Lewis Simpson on January 17, 1949. Today, the surf that carried Simpson's ships for 3/4 of a century yet beats against the rugged cliffs at Short Acres. New growths of timber spread across the mountainsides that once heard the sound of Simpson Company axes and the oaths of Northwest loggers, but a new generation has taken control in the land where once the name Simpson was the magic name in lumber. And here is the mansion. And I couldn't tell if this is made of brick or if these are like wood cedar planks. I mean, it seems like somebody in the lumber industry would use wood, but you just can't tell. Can't really tell, but it's pretty neat that all of this is still there, and now it's a public park. I didn't know that they had trees from all over the world planted there, but definitely makes me want to go check out some more of the trees and spend a little more time in the garden areas. So, and now I'm just going to read you a little bit of history on the founder. So Louis Jerome Simpson is the founder of North Bend. So we just read about his dad, and now we're going to read about him. Louis Jerome Simpson was a civic-minded Oregonian who served the South Coast, the state, and the nation in his active years as builder and advocate. He worked vigorously to bring railroad service to Coos Bay area, accomplished in 1916, and traveled the West Coast during World War I to urge support for a military highway, eventually US 101. Simpson also traveled widely in Oregon on behalf of the Red Cross and Liberty Bond campaigns. Whether lobbying for funds in Washington, D.C. for the port of Coos Bay, promoting migration to the region, or working on his dairy farm to improve Oregon herds, Simpson succeeded in rallying people to his causes. Simpson was the son of a wealthy shipping and timber magnate, Asa Mead Simpson. Born in Oakland, California in 1877, he attended Belmont School and graduated from Mount Tamalpais Military Academy in 1895. Illness cut short his university studies at Berkeley. Posted in 1898 to learn the business at the family's Northwestern Lumber Company in Hoquiam, Washington, Simpson rebelled by drinking, gambling, and incurring debts. Yet his artistic nature flourished, and he wrote short stories, acted in local theater, sang, and orated. He also fell in love with Cassandra Stearns, who divorced her husband in 1899 to marry him. The forbearing elder Simpson, Asa, gave the young couple a new start at his company town in North Bend, north of Marshfield, today's city of Coos Bay. Simpson, known as LJ, worked hard and rose to managerial position. Unlike his father, he had expansionist ideas for the area. He purchased the adjacent Yarrow Town site, combined it with his father's holdings, and in 1903 created the city of North Bend. To spur growth, he gave away waterfront sites for manufacturing plants and other lots for hospital and churches. Using his own and his family's money, he invested in new businesses. He also helped form a commercial club and recruited professionals, including the town's first doctor. Simpson served as the city's first mayor until 1915. Simpson built a large basketball park in North Bend where he played on the Simpsons Company-sponsored team. He also subsidized a community concert band. In 1906 and 1907, Simpson built a large seaside home for his wife Cassandra, Shore Acres. Shore Acres. Cassandra preferred Shore Acres. On the ocean, about 14 miles from Coos Bay, North Bend, eventually included an indoor swimming pool, spacious gardens, a modern farm, and a dairy herd. The Simpsons moved to Shore Acres in 1915. Simpson campaigned unsuccessfully for the Republican nomination for governor in 1918, losing to Governor James Whitcomb, and then returned to oversee the farm. He regularly traveled to Salem, where he lobbied the legislature for good roads. Cassandra Simpson died in April of 1921, and the Shore Acres mansion burned in July. So, wow, that's crazy that she died and then the mansion burned. And then he remarried in 1922, and he and Leila Gardner adopted 2 infant girls. The family lived in the Gardner's cottage until 1928, when they moved into a new house built on the original Shore Acres site. Simpson directed his promotional talents to the town of Empire, where he invested heavily in rebuilding the old Southern Oregon Company's sawmill. The crash of 1929 and the ensuing depression took first the sawmill and then property after property, including the mortgaged Shore Acres. In December 1939, Simpson suffered a stroke. Bankruptcy came in 1940. The Shore Acres mortgage holder sold the estate to the state of Oregon for parkland in 1942, and the property was leased temporarily to the War Department. After the war, the house was determined unsuitable for restoration and was razed in late 1948, which means destroyed or torn down. When Simpson died of cancer at his Barview home in January 1949, the Oregonian wrote, "In the records of our region, his place is secure among the names of the builders. His coastal properties became popular state parks, Sunset Beach, Shore Acres, and Cape Arago." Pretty cool. Pretty cool. And here is one other picture that I was able to find of the old mansion. This is during World War II, 1943. So this was just a few years before. When did he pass away? 48? Yeah, it's an amazing. You can almost see, like, it feels like you can almost see 360 degrees, but you can definitely see at least 180 degrees of the ocean, because it's like at this bluff. There's a lookout here, and you can see all the way from this angle. See, if you look at Google Earth here, Shore Acres, Cape Arago. Okay, so this is where we're at. And you're up really high, and you can just see the ocean from this way all the way to this way. It's wild. And, you know, this is another thing that proves that the earth is flat, because you can see for so many miles. Miles and miles and miles, and there is not a curve. It is the same on this side as it is on this side. You know, they always talk about, you know, seeing the curve from this way looking out, but what about from side to side when you're looking at a horizon line? So, yeah, These are some of the pictures. Just going to show you from Google Earth, and that's the history. That's the history of Coos Bay, and a pretty cool one at that. We have a very rich timber history, which, you know, my wonderful husband was also a logger, so it's something that's very close to my heart. And yeah, hope you guys enjoyed today's presentation, and have a wonderful